So I'm not going to do anything dramatic other than talk to you, because what I'm going to be saying today is all about what it means to listen and what happens when we start listening. So I've got no fancy slides, just my name, which is quite long and apparently fancy. But anyway, let's go from there. I'm going to start with asking everybody, how many of you were born in Durham? So we don't have one person in this room who's born in Durham. That's really interesting. And I always ask this question when I'm teaching about migration and forced migration. Most of us leave our homes to make a better life for ourselves. Some of us are forced to leave our home because of war and conflict. And coming back to the theme of war and conflict, what we are very good at doing is to remember war and conflict. We are very good at remembering it, particularly remembering people who have given up their lives in war and conflict. We spend a lot of money, or nations spend a lot of money building memorials. We have awards in the name of fallen soldiers. We engrave their names in expensive stones, sometimes marble, in fancy font. What we don't do as well is remembering women. Women are often treated as accidental footnotes into history, particularly, but not only in the context of war and history. So when you're talking about women in the context of war and conflict, you might sometimes think about them as widows, grieving widows of fallen soldiers. You might think of them as sisters. And sometimes you think of them as symbols, or they're created as symbols. So the idea, for instance, of Mother India, so India is where I come from, which probably is not a great shock to you to kind of hear. But we think of them as symbols representing countries and communities. We don't often think of them as people who experience and suffer during war and conflict. But to put this in context, most women, or many women who have experienced war and conflict, or have come from places which have war and conflict, have experienced different forms of violence and abuse. There hasn't been, sadly, I started off as a historian and I'm a sociologist now, but there hasn't been a war in human history that I know of where people who've been victorious post-war haven't sexually assaulted women and girls from the country that they've defeated. So wars are built on the bodies of women, but those women don't end up feeling, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a couple of minutes, women don't end up feeling that they actually own the body that they inhabit. So just to give you a sense of context and around what happens with after war and conflict, is that very often people end up getting displaced. They leave their country of origin. And there are a lot of statistics. They've gone straight out of my head, as statistics do. But they're huge number. One statistic that always sticks in my mind is 1 in 3 women globally have experienced some form of violence and abuse in their life. That could be from people they love, or it could be from strangers, but they've experienced sexual and other forms of gender-based violence in their life. And those stories are never heard. What war does is it actually exacerbates that violence and conflict. War hasn't created it, but it's created context in which those forms of violence and abuse almost get kind of exaggerated, if you like. So to just give you an example, I was once reading uh, the testimony of a woman, and a woman who was seeking asylum, and she was being questioned around about the reasons that she was seeking asylum. And she started the testimony. I was hearing this in my head late at night as I was going through the testimony. And what she started describing her experience in heartbreaking detail. But then she was interrupted by somebody who was questioning her, saying that she wasn't presenting it chronologically, asked her to go back and start from the beginning. At that point, I realized that suffering has timelines. And that is something that has stayed with me for quite a long time. Okay, now I'm going to do something which is quite rare to do in academia. It's often something that's done in footnotes. I'm going to talk about myself a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the reasons why I started doing this work. I started doing this work because when I first started reading, for two reasons. First, when I started reading around stuff around violence and abuse, I was under the impression, like many of us, that these experiences are exceptions. But actually they are not. We've talked about the statistics of 1 in 3, and behind all those women are, there's a story there that we don't know about. The second thing is I want to take you back. Can't take you back because many of you are really young, but I want to take you back to 1990s in India. There was a woman called Bhauri Devi, a woman in her 40s at the time. She was a Dalit woman. That's, for those of you not familiar with what Dalit is, it's part of the caste system, and it's a caste which is euphemistically called lower caste. Dalit woman who was working for a government organization, and she reported as part of her job an upper caste family for having child marriage, getting one of their daughters who was very young married, which was against the law. They were arrested, but members of the extended family in retaliation came and raped her. It was gang rape, and her husband was held down and forced to watch. This case went up to the Supreme Court, went up to the Sessions Court in Jaipur, and the judge acquitted all the rapists. Essentially, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but essentially because they felt that Bhauri Devi was lying, because there wasn't any way that upper caste men would rape a Dalit woman. I went for this rally in Jaipur where there were hundreds of thousands of people, but I don't remember that. I kind of remember the heat and the smells, but what I remember was this remarkable woman in her 40s speaking and saying, I don't feel ashamed to stand here and tell you that I've been raped. The rape doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the people who raped me. And I thought that was remarkable because in my native language, and a lot of languages in India and in other parts of the world, I imagine, when women get raped, they say, I was spoiled. And it comes back to believing that your body doesn't belong to you. It's an object that belongs to somebody else and can be destroyed by somebody else. So you lack ownership of the thing that you inhabit every single day. And it was also at that point that I realized that what Bhauri Devi had done was so powerful. She had reclaimed the way that we defined shame and reclaimed the way that we defined justice. And I started thinking about how many women find it hard to do that, not because not because they're not brave. They're brave because they live with violence and abuse on a day-to-day basis. not because they lack the courage to do it, but because the act of speaking out can be really dangerous. I mean, it almost destroyed Bhavri Devi. You might say this was in the 1990s, but there's been work done around the Me Too movement in globally. And what we've seen is that women who have spoken out haven't necessarily benefited from speaking out. The men who were named, even where there was evidence, their careers haven't ended. So there is a cost to speaking, and the cost to speaking is that nobody hears women when they speak, or they hear them, they nod their heads, and then they go on. And I've sometimes seen myself do that as well. You read testimony after testimony, and you keep talking to women day after day, and after a while you start thinking of them as stories. You don't think of them as humans. But I just want to leave you with this one story of this woman that I actually interviewed as part of a research project. She had come from another country to the UK, and she'd had a long journey. And I said to her, when did you last feel safe? And she looked at me, she wasn't offended, she's just surprised, and she said, safe from whom? And it was at that point I realized that actually when politicians and policymakers talk about safe countries, or we talk about safe spaces, most of us, most women, are quietly thinking, there isn't a safe space for us at all, whether it's the home, whether it's the university, whether it's war zones, or whether it's a camp, a refugee or asylum-seeking camp. And I want to leave you with that thought, what happens, or what can happen if we start believing women, we start listening to women, and we start paying attention to their stories and not treating them as visa categories or as acronyms or as cases. What will happen if we start taking their stories seriously? I think that's when this world will tip over into actually being a much better place than it is at the moment. Thank you.